Good evening. We at St. John's like to think of ourselves as hospitable people. Just look at our vision statement. It's printed right there on your bulletin. The vision of St. John's is to manifest God's love through invitation, inclusion, faith, and action. Invitation is the first of the 4 ways we strive to manifest God's love in the world, and inclusion is the second. We aspire to be inviting and to include everyone. My own experience testifies to the hospitable culture that exists here at St. John's. My husband and I ventured into St. John's Sanctuary for the first time early one Sunday morning in August 2017. We were warmly welcomed by Karen and Gil Gleason, rest his dear soul, and Martha and Mike Helms. That welcome was quickly followed by a formal welcome letter and a personal visit from Scott, inviting us back not only to a church service, but inviting us into the community that is St. John's. We even received a loaf of freshly baked bread. We were touched. Tonight's gospel reading prompted me to think about hospitality. I think we're all familiar with the historical fact that foot washing was a gesture of hospitality in the culture in which Jesus lived. People wore sandals and roads were unpaved, which led to dusty feet and a need and desire to wash them. In first century Palestine, it was common for a host to offer water for a guest to wash their own feet, or for a servant or slave to wash a guest's feet before the guest entered the host's home. It was a practical as well as a pleasant thing to do, at least for the one whose feet were being washed. The kind of foot washing that we encounter in tonight's gospel, however, wasn't that practical, pleasant, customary kind of foot washing. First, it didn't occur when the disciples arrived at the home of the host of the Passover meal. No, it occurred during supper, John tells us, not beforehand. And presumably, the disciples' feet had already been washed once that night before they crossed the threshold. Second, it wasn't a slave or lowly servant who prepared a basin of water and donned a towel. It was Jesus himself, the disciples' esteemed and beloved Lord and teacher, the Messiah, as Peter had proclaimed earlier. Those 2 facts alone tell us that this was more than an ordinary act of Jesus-era hospitality. So what is going on here? The author of a Maundy Thursday sermon that I found posted on the website, episcopalchurch.org, under the heading, Sermons That Work, explained it this way. Jesus knows that his disciples are slow to understand what servanthood and divine love look like in the world. So he shows them by washing their feet. I'm not satisfied with that explanation of what obviously was a disorienting and confusing act to those who witnessed and experienced it. I imagine that all the disciples were thinking what only Peter had the temerity to say out loud. You're going to wash my feet? No way. But what if the lesson of foot washing is about hospitality? A radical, revolutionary, even subversive kind of hospitality that casts aside convention and turns the social and political order on its head, that models not just humble and loving service, but points to the boundless hospitality of God What if the lesson for the disciples and for us is that in the face of confusion and fear of losing someone we love, as the disciples surely must have felt when Jesus told them that he was going away and they couldn't go with him, God is tender, gentle, and unconditionally accepting, a soothing presence who cradles our tired feet in loving hands like a parent cradles a young child. Or what if the lesson is about the transforming power of love that comes from opening one's heart to another with no thought of personal benefit, of letting oneself be vulnerable and radically available, as Jesus did, not only in washing the disciples' feet, but in giving them and us the gift of himself, of his whole self, body and blood. What is to be our response to a God who is radically hospitable? We might ask ourselves, what should we as a church and as individuals do to be more hospitable, to truly live out our vision of being inviting and inclusive? But perhaps that's not the right first question to ask. Perhaps the right first question to ask ourselves is, who must we become in order to embody and actualize our vision? For real hospitality begins with who we are. If we choose to become radically hospitable, and we do have a choice to make, I suggest that we need to start from the inside, from inside our hearts. A place to begin is engaging in a spiritual practice like centering prayer or labyrinth walking, meditating or doing yoga, even making music or making sandwiches to feed people who are hungry and unsheltered. These are just examples of possible activities that, if engaged in regularly and mindfully, can be spiritual practices that deepen our relationship with the divine. And it's in a relationship with the source of radical hospitality, which is also the source of love, that we can allow our hearts to open wider, our judgments to be replaced by acceptance, our defenses and fears to lessen, and ourselves to be transformed by God's overflowing love, so that with God's grace, we too can become radically hospitable. St. John's is already moving in this direction. Ann Meyer, a new member of St. John's Vestry, is planning to call interested parishioners together, probably next month, to discuss suggestions for spiritual practices that came from the stewardship gatherings that were held last fall. I hope you'll be drawn to participate. And I hope that we all can embark on a spiritual journey, a journey of acceptance of self and other, of making ourselves radically available to persons we know and to those we don't know, of welcoming the marginalized, the lost, the forgotten, and those who are different from us politically, socially, culturally, and of taking the opportunity whenever it arises, one person at a time, to make a neighbor of a stranger. And may the radically hospitable God who sent Jesus to teach us to love and serve one another be our guide and companion.